Thomas, a 72-year-old war veteran, sat quietly in a restaurant with his service dog Duke at his feet, until the manager's cruel words shattered the peace. "Pets aren't allowed here," she sneered, grabbing Duke's leash. But what happened next would shake the room to its core as a hidden hero rose from the crowd to defend Thomas, leading to a chain of events no one saw coming. If you are new here, then please subscribe this channel and show thumbs up by liking the video. Now let's move to this wonderful story. Thomas King, a 72-year-old retired Army veteran, walked slowly along the street, his cane tapping rhythmically with each step. It had been a cold morning, and the chill in the air seemed to penetrate his bones, but Thomas was used to it. His joints, stiff from arthritis, ached as he made his way through the neighborhood. Beside him, walking with a calm, measured stride, was Duke, his German Shepherd service dog, his loyal companion for years. Thomas smiled as he patted Duke on the head. The dog, trained to help him navigate life with PTSD, was more than just an animal to him. Duke had saved his life during their deployment overseas, and in the years since had never left his side. Now, in retirement, Duke was there to help him in small ways, opening doors, guiding him through crowds, and offering the comfort that only a service dog could. As they walked, Thomas's mind wandered to the past. The memory of the battlefield still haunted him at times, especially in moments of quiet like this. But when Duke was by his side, Thomas felt a little less alone in the world. They had developed a daily routine, one that brought some sense of normalcy to Thomas's life. Today, Thomas decided to treat himself and Duke to lunch at a new cafe that had just opened in town. It was called Bella's Bistro, and it had been getting rave reviews. As they approached the restaurant, Thomas felt a sense of anticipation. After all, it had been a long time since he had done something for himself. Duke, sensing his companion's slight excitement, wagged his tail and stayed close to him, ready for whatever the day would bring. They were greeted warmly by a hostess when they entered the restaurant. "Table for one, please," Thomas said politely, his voice a little rough with age. "Somewhere quiet if possible, and my dog will stay under the table. He's fully trained." The hostess smiled at Thomas and nodded. "Of course, sir. Right this way." She led them to a quiet corner at the back of the room away from the main traffic. Thomas settled into the chair, his cane placed gently beside him. Duke, as trained, immediately curled up under the table, resting his head on his paws, his eyes alert but calm. Thomas ordered a simple club sandwich and a coffee, savoring the thought of a peaceful meal. It wasn't long before the trouble began. The manager of the restaurant, Lisa Wilcox, had been watching Thomas and Duke from across the room. As she noticed the service dog under the table, her expression hardened. Her steps were deliberate and sharp as she walked over to Thomas's table, her heels clicking loudly on the tiled floor. "Excuse me, sir," Lisa said, her voice loud enough for nearby diners to hear. "Pets are not allowed in this establishment." Thomas looked up, startled by the tone of her voice. "Ma'am, Duke is not a pet, he's a service dog," he explained calmly, his fingers reaching for his wallet. "I have all the documentation here if you'd like to see it." But Lisa wasn't listening. She cut him off before he could finish. "This is a restaurant, not a kennel," she said sharply, her eyes narrowing. "I don't care what papers you have. I said get that dog out of here now." The words stung, and Thomas felt his face flush with embarrassment. All around him, the sounds of the restaurant seemed to fade, and he felt the weight of the room's gaze upon him. The other diners, who had once been talking and laughing, now sat in uncomfortable silence. A young couple at a nearby table exchanged glances, whispering something under their breath. Thomas couldn't make out the words, but the judgment was clear. His hands, once steady enough to disarm explosives under enemy fire, began to tremble. His heart raced and he felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the onset of a panic attack. But this time, it wasn't the battlefield that triggered the fear. It was the humiliation. His breath became shallow as the anxiety gripped him, and for a moment he wasn't in the restaurant anymore. He was back in the chaos of war, surrounded by danger and fear. "Please," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper, as he reached out to hold onto Duke's leash. "Don't touch his leash, he's trained to stay calm." But Lisa wasn't listening. She grabbed the leash and yanked it, pulling Duke closer to the edge of the table. Duke whimpered at the sudden movement, pressing his body closer to Thomas's legs. Thomas's hands shook more violently now, and his breathing quickened as the anxiety deepened. The manager's voice grew louder. "Either the dog goes, or you both go," she snapped. Thomas stood up slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The restaurant was completely silent now, and Thomas felt the eyes of every diner on him. His shoulders slumped under the weight of the moment. He had faced enemy fire with less fear than the humiliation now washing over him. With as much dignity as he could muster, Thomas placed his napkin on the table, rose to his feet, and reached for his cane. "Come on, Duke," he said softly, the words barely audible as he turned to leave. The manager stood in front of him, blocking the exit. "If you don't leave right now, I'm calling the police," she threatened, her arms crossed in a victorious stance. Thomas didn't respond. His jaw clenched tightly, and he focused only on making a dignified exit. His mind raced, but there was nothing he could do. He had been trained to fight in battles that mattered, but this wasn't one of them. Around him, the restaurant remained silent. The people who had been so quick to clap for soldiers and veterans when they were on stage or in uniform now sat in silence, unwilling to speak up when it truly mattered. As Thomas reached the door, the tension in the room was palpable. The moment had been painful, and he could feel the weight of it bearing down on him. With one last glance at the empty table, Thomas stepped outside into the harsh sunlight. The world seemed indifferent to his struggles, but at least he had Duke, and that small comfort was enough to get him through this. Outside, he paused on the sidewalk, unsure of where to go next. His hand trembled more violently now, the adrenaline of the confrontation still coursing through his body. But at least Duke was there by his side, and in that moment, Thomas knew that he wasn't entirely alone. Thomas stood outside the restaurant, his heart pounding in his chest as he adjusted his cane. His mind raced with thoughts, but it was hard to focus on anything. The fresh air outside didn't seem to soothe him. Instead, it felt like a harsh reminder of the indignity he had just experienced. He glanced down at Duke, who sat quietly by his side, sensing his companion's distress. The dog's presence was a comfort, but it didn't erase the sting of the words, the look of scorn from the manager and the silence from the other diners. As Thomas stood there, the door to the restaurant suddenly opened, and the young waiter, James, stepped out, his face full of concern. He looked at Thomas and then at Duke, his eyes soft with sympathy. "Sir," James began, his voice shaky but sincere. I am so sorry about what happened in there. That wasn't right. You didn't deserve that." Thomas looked up at James, but the words were hard to find. After everything that had happened, he wasn't sure how to respond. All he could do was nod slowly. His throat tightened as he looked back at the window of the restaurant where he could see the life inside returning to normal. The laughter, the clinking of silverware, and the hum of conversation were all happening, as if nothing had just occurred. Inside, Lisa was already seating a new group at the table where Thomas had just been. Her confident stride and the sound of her voice made it clear that the incident was already fading in her mind, as if it had never even happened. But for Thomas, it wasn't over. The pain of the humiliation still lingered, gnawing at him. He felt small and exposed, the weight of the situation heavier than the cane in his hand. He had been to war. He had faced down enemies that wanted to take his life. But here, in a simple restaurant, he had been stripped of his dignity by someone who didn't care to understand. Someone who hadn't even given him a chance to explain. "I'll be okay, James," Thomas said softly, his voice cracking slightly. Just need some time to clear my head." The young waiter hesitated, looking as though he wanted to say more, but instead he simply nodded and stepped back toward the restaurant. "If you ever need anything," James called out, "please let me know. I'll make sure no one treats you like that again." Thomas watched him go, but the words didn't offer the comfort they should have. The damage had already been done. Thomas sighed and turned away, leading Duke down the sidewalk. Each step felt heavier than the last, but he pushed forward, knowing that going back into that restaurant was not an option. The world around him seemed to blur, his mind clouded by the memory of the confrontation. As they walked, Thomas's thoughts shifted. He remembered the woman he had helped earlier that day, the one struggling with her groceries. He had stopped to offer her assistance without hesitation, just as he had been trained to do. She had appreciated it, and in that moment, he had felt like the man he once was. But now, as he walked down the street with his loyal dog by his side, he felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. Just as he was about to turn the corner, a voice called out behind him. "Sir, please wait." Thomas stopped and turned around, surprised. A young woman, probably in her 30s, was walking toward him. She was dressed in business attire and looked to be in a hurry, but her eyes were kind, and there was a concern in her gaze that caught Thomas off guard. She was holding a small bouquet of flowers in her hands. Are you okay?" the woman asked, her voice soft with genuine care. "I saw what happened back there and, well, I just wanted to make sure you're all right." Thomas blinked in surprise. "I'm fine, ma'am. Just a little shaken up." The woman nodded. "I heard everything, and I wanted to tell you that what happened wasn't right. No one should treat anyone like that, especially a veteran. You've done so much for this country and you deserve respect, not humiliation." Thomas looked at her, unsure of what to say. It wasn't often that people approached him like this. Most simply avoided eye contact or pretended not to notice when something was wrong. But this woman, she seemed different. Her kindness was a balm to his wounded pride. "Thank you," Thomas said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. He paused for a moment before adding, "It's hard sometimes, you know. You think people understand, but then this happens." The woman smiled gently and handed him the flowers. "For you," she said softly. "I don't know if they'll make it better, but I thought you deserved something beautiful to take home." Thomas took the bouquet, his hands shaking slightly. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to him. "Thank you," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman nodded and walked away, but Thomas stood there for a moment, looking down at the flowers in his hands. It wasn't much, but it was a reminder that not everyone was indifferent. Some people still cared, still recognized the sacrifices that veterans like him had made. And that thought, small as it was, gave him a glimmer of hope as Thomas continued, walking. The sting of the confrontation began to fade just a little. He wasn't sure where he was going, but for the first time since leaving the restaurant, he felt a sense of calm. Duke walked beside him, steady and true, as always. Thomas knew that no matter what happened next, he wasn't truly alone. He had Duke, and he had the quiet support of people like the woman who had stopped to give him flowers. And with that thought, Thomas took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and continued on his way, ready to face whatever the day would bring. Thomas continued walking down the street, the bouquet of flowers gently resting in his hand. The sunlight, though warm, didn't feel as harsh as it had just moments before. His steps were slower now, each one deliberate, as he moved farther away from the restaurant. Duke, his loyal German shepherd, kept pace beside him, his presence a constant reminder that at least in this moment, Thomas wasn't alone. The tightness in Thomas's chest began to ease, but the humiliation still clung to him like a shadow. The world around him seemed to blur as he walked, his thoughts racing in a million directions. What had just happened back in that restaurant? How could someone, especially a person in charge, treat another human being, especially a veteran, like that? Thomas had seen many battles in his life, but this one, this small, seemingly insignificant battle, had shaken him to the core. It wasn't the physical threat of danger that had unsettled him, but the emotional toll of being disregarded, humiliated, and dismissed by someone who had no idea what it was like to serve, to sacrifice. As he wandered through the quiet streets, lost in his thoughts, a sudden noise caught his attention. The sound of a car approaching broke through his reverie, and Thomas turned to see a black SUV pulling up alongside him. The vehicle slowed to a stop, and the driver's side window rolled down. Thomas instinctively stiffened, wary of who might be inside. But as the window descended, a familiar face appeared. Mark, a lieutenant colonel in the military with whom Thomas had served many years ago. Staff Sergeant King? Mark's voice was warm, with a hint of recognition that made Thomas's heart skip a beat. He hadn't expected to see anyone from his past today, certainly not under these circumstances. Thomas blinked in surprise and looked at the man. "Mark? Is that you?" Thomas asked, his voice laced with confusion. He hadn't seen Mark since their deployment years ago, and the sight of his old comrade immediately brought a sense of familiarity that Thomas hadn't realized he'd been missing. Mark smiled and nodded, his face softening with respect. "Yes, sir, it's me. I've been following your story, what happened back at the restaurant. I called some people. Word travels fast in our community, you know." Mark's eyes twinkled with understanding, and Thomas felt a small spark of hope light up inside him. Before Thomas could respond, Mark continued. "The guys and we'd be honored if you'd join us for lunch. We've been through a lot together, and we still have each other's backs." Mark's words felt like a lifeline thrown to Thomas, and for the first time since leaving the restaurant, Thomas felt a shift in his emotions. A shift from the sharp sting of humiliation to the warmth of camaraderie and understanding. Thomas hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say. He had been through so much on his own for so long, and he wasn't sure if he could accept the offer. But looking at Mark, and then down at Duke, who was standing by his side with a calm but attentive gaze, Thomas realized that he wasn't alone anymore. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to accept help. "You've got a deal," Thomas said finally, his voice stronger than it had been in hours. "Lead the way, Mark." Mark's smile widened and he nodded before stepping out of the SUV. "Great to hear, sir," he said as he opened the back door for Thomas. The 4 Marines who had been sitting in the vehicle stepped out one by one, their faces serious but filled with the quiet respect that only fellow soldiers could understand. Thomas was surprised by how familiar their presence felt. They're not as strangers but as brothers, sharing a bond that no one else could truly understand. As they walked toward the restaurant, Thomas felt a strange sense of pride swelling in his chest. It wasn't pride in his past achievements or the recognition he'd received from others, but pride in the fact that he was no longer facing the world alone. His comrades, his brothers in arms, were with him now, and that made all the difference. He had always fought alone in his mind, carrying the weight of the past, but today that weight was being shared. When they reached the entrance of the restaurant, Thomas noticed that the atmosphere had completely shifted. Where there had once been discomfort and judgment, there was now a sense of solidarity and respect. The diners who had earlier whispered and snickered behind their menus now sat with their heads held high, some of them even nodding in Thomas's direction as the Marines walked in behind him. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The Marines entered the restaurant first, forming a protective line around Thomas and Duke. The hostess, who had initially greeted Thomas with a polite smile, now looked at him with a newfound respect. "Table for you, sir?" she asked, her tone warmer than before. Thomas nodded, grateful for the subtle but meaningful shift in the atmosphere. "Yes, please," he said quietly. "A quiet corner would be fine." As they sat down at a table near the back, Thomas couldn't help but feel the weight of the past few hours begin to lift. It wasn't just about the meal or the company, it was about the recognition of what he had sacrificed, what he had given, and the fact that his brothers in arms were still standing by him, just as they had in the past. As the conversation around the table flowed, Thomas found himself laughing, genuinely, laughing for the first time in what felt like forever. The Marines shared stories from their time in the service, recalling moments of bravery, camaraderie, and even the light-hearted jokes they had told to keep their spirits high during the darkest times. Thomas, despite his weariness, felt himself drawn into the warmth of the conversation, the bonds that had been forged in battle now being strengthened over a meal. It was in that moment, surrounded by his fellow Marines, that Thomas realized something important. No matter how many years had passed, no matter how far he had gone from the battlefield, the connection they shared would never fade. It was a bond that time, distance, and even humiliation couldn't break. As he sat there sharing stories and laughter with the people who truly understood him, Thomas finally felt like he was home again. The meal passed in a blur of conversation, laughter, and shared stories, but for Thomas it was more than just food. It was a reminder of the bonds that had always been there, even if they had been forgotten or buried beneath years of solitude and pain. As the Marines spoke about their time in the service, Thomas felt the weight of the past few hours, no, the past few years, beginning to lift. For the first time in a long time, he felt understood. The restaurant, once a place of embarrassment and humiliation, now felt like a place of refuge. Thomas noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere around him. The patrons who had once avoided eye contact or whispered behind their menus were now watching him with a sense of respect. Some nodded toward him, a silent acknowledgement of his sacrifice. Others gave a small smile, perhaps recognizing the quiet dignity that Thomas carried. With him, it wasn't much, but it was enough. It was a start. As Thomas took a sip of his coffee, he looked around the room and saw the elderly woman who had spoken to him earlier. She was sitting with her husband at a nearby table, her eyes soft and understanding as she glanced over at Thomas. Their earlier exchange, though brief, had given Thomas a glimpse of kindness in a world that often seemed indifferent. But now, with the Marines around him, Thomas felt a strength he hadn't realized he was missing. "You okay, sir?" Mark asked, breaking Thomas's train of thought. The lieutenant colonel sat across from him, a thoughtful look on his face. Thomas nodded slowly, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. "Yeah, I'm fine now. Just didn't expect any of this. You know, what happened at the restaurant, the way things went down. It's been a while since anyone stood up for me like that." Mark's eyes softened. "You've got brothers who've always got your back, Thomas. Never forget that." We all stand together, as if to emphasize the point. The other Marines raised their glasses in a silent salute to Thomas, and he returned the gesture with a quiet nod of gratitude. The camaraderie that had once been so familiar to him now felt like a lifeline, a reminder that he wasn't forgotten, that his service and sacrifice had meant something even if the world outside didn't always see it. Just as they were finishing their meal, the door to the restaurant opened again, and a new group of diners walked in. Thomas didn't pay much attention at first, but then he heard the unmistakable sound of heels clicking across the floor. Lisa, the restaurant manager, had arrived, and Thomas's gaze met hers from across the room. Her expression was noticeably different from earlier. There was no arrogance, no certainty in her stance. Instead, there was a subtle shift in her posture, a slight unease as she glanced toward Thomas and the group of Marines surrounding him. As Lisa approached the hostess stand, Thomas's eyes didn't leave her. He had no intention of confronting her. He was beyond that. But the moment was significant in its own way. It was a recognition, an acknowledgement, and Thomas realized that, in some small way, he had regained his dignity. It wasn't just about winning a confrontation or proving something to anyone. It was about the quiet strength that came from being true to who he was and what he had done for his country. When their eyes met again, Lisa hesitated for a moment before looking away. The subtle shift in her gaze told Thomas everything he needed to know. She had seen him, and she understood, even if she wasn't ready to admit it aloud. Thomas had never been one to seek confrontation, and he certainly wasn't going to start now. The past was the past, and he had far more important things to focus on, like the men and women who had stood by him, like Duke, who was resting quietly at his feet, and like the life he still had ahead of him. As the meal came to a close, Thomas stood, his knees creaking slightly as he rose from the chair. The Marines followed his lead, standing at attention, in perfect unison. Thomas's eyes swept across the room once more, taking in the looks of respect from the other patrons. It wasn't the kind of recognition he had once dreamed of, but it was the kind that mattered most. When Thomas reached the door to leave, he paused for a moment, glancing back at the table where the Marines had sat. Jake, the young waiter who had spoken up earlier, was standing by the door, a look of quiet respect on his face. "Sir," Jake said, his voice firm but sincere, "it was an honor serving with you both then and now." Thomas returned the salute with a steady hand, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Jake," he said quietly. "Thank you for speaking up when it mattered." The Marines filed out behind Thomas, and as they stepped into the bright afternoon sunlight, Thomas felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The world had not changed, but Thomas had. He had rediscovered the bonds of brotherhood, the strength of honor, and the quiet dignity that came with living a life of service. Outside, the elderly woman from earlier was waiting for him again, this time with a small bouquet of flowers in her hands. "For your wife," she said simply, her voice full of warmth. "I heard the story, and I thought you might like to have something beautiful to take home." Thomas, moved by her kindness, accepted the flowers with a gentle nod. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say." The woman smiled softly. "You don't have to say anything. Heroes deserve beautiful things." As Thomas turned to leave, he felt the weight of the past few hours shift again. No longer did he feel the sting of humiliation or the bitterness of isolation. He had found something far more valuable: respect. Not from strangers or those who applauded him from a distance, but from those who understood the true cost of service. The simple gesture of kindness from the woman, the Marine's unspoken solidarity, and the quiet recognition of his worth were the things that truly mattered. With Duke by his side, Thomas walked down the street once more, the flowers in his hand, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He had faced down many battles in his life, but this one, this small, quiet battle, had been the one that reminded him that sometimes the greatest victories come not from the fight itself, but from the respect we give each other, no matter the circumstances. And with that thought, Thomas took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and walked forward, ready for whatever came next.